Have you ever stopped mid-breath and asked yourself a single question that unsettles the very ground beneath your feet? That is how Elias Moreno's story begins. Not with a grand entrance, not with gunfire, not with medals or heroism, but with a question whispered in the quiet corners of his mind. What do you do when you are ordered to watch, but your conscience begs you to act? At 22, Elias was a gentle soul tucked into a world that had no patience for gentleness. He was the kind of young man who paused to admire a sunset, even when running late, who saw stray dogs and fed them scraps, who apologized when someone bumped into him. War did not suit men like him, but war never asked for suitability. It demanded bodies, hands, and silence from those who wished for anything else. Elias enlisted because he needed to escape the suffocating sorrow of home. His father had passed, his mother worked 2 jobs, and the world felt unbearably loud. The Army Air Forces offered him a position that seemed harmless compared to the chaos others faced. Photographer, observer, never a participant, or so he was told. From the moment he arrived at the dusty training field in Arizona, the rules were made very clear to him. Captain Briggs, a stern, middle-aged man with a jaw carved from disapproval, repeated the instruction so many times it began to sound like a curse. You are here to take photographs, not to fight, not to interfere, not to play hero. Elias nodded obediently each time, clutching his camera the way others clung to rifles. The camera felt like a shield, thin, fragile, but familiar. He believed he could hide behind it, separate himself from the violence. He wanted to be useful without being destructive. He wanted to see the world without adding to its suffering. Photographers documented the truth, they said, but no one warned him how heavy truth could be. While the war was a machine of devastation, Elias's heart refused to stop noticing the small, painfully fragile pieces of humanity that survived within it. He photographed the wreckage of planes, the scars on landscapes, the broken remains of battles. But he also photographed soldiers laughing at crude jokes, pilots writing letters they hoped someone would read, children peeking from behind ruined homes, eyes full of questions too large for their age. To him, these moments mattered just as much as the strategy and destruction. Captain Briggs once slammed a stack of photos onto Elias's desk and barked, "Moreno, command asked for tactical documentation, not art." But Elias merely bowed his head. In truth, he wasn't creating art. He was creating memory, something war tried its hardest to erase. In late 1943, whispers spread through the camp about a small Pacific island the Japanese forces were fortifying. Reconnaissance was needed. Dangerous, yes, but simple, as Briggs called it. Fly in, photograph the enemy. Airfield, fly out, that's all. No improvisation, no dramatics. Elias wanted to refuse. His instincts screamed that something was wrong. But refusal was not an option in war. The mission paired him with Dale Harper, a 19-year-old pilot whose confidence was larger than his frame. Dale joked endlessly, masking fear with bravado the way many young men did. "Relax, Moreno," he said, patting the side of their small plane. "I've danced with worse skies. You just take your pictures." Elias smiled weakly, but inside he prepared himself for turbulence, of more than just the air. The flight began smoothly. The ocean glittered below them, calm and deceptively peaceful. Elias pressed his camera to the window, capturing the coastline, the tree line, the shifting colors of the sea. But then the island came into view, and Elias froze. Below them, arranged with chilling precision, were 40 Japanese Zero fighter planes lined in rows like silent predators waiting to pounce. Combat ready, unattended, an enormous threat poised to strike at any moment. "Dale, you need to look at this," Elias murmured. Dale glanced down, and the color drained from his face. Oh no, if those take off..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Elias raised his camera and captured image after image, but a sick heaviness settled in his stomach. The photos suddenly felt unbearably inadequate. What good was a picture against 40 engines of destruction? Before they could retreat, a faint glint appeared against the horizon. 2 glints, then 4. Enemy fighters. "Hold on!" Dale shouted as he jerked the plane sharply. The sky erupted with bullets. Metal screamed. Glass shattered. Elias clung to his seat, his camera bouncing against his chest. The enemy planes closed in mercilessly. Dale maneuvered with desperate skill, but their small reconnaissance craft stood no chance against seasoned fighters. A burst of gunfire ripped through the left wing. "We're hit!" Dale yelled. The plane spun wildly, dropping altitude at a terrifying speed. Elias closed his eyes and prayed, not for himself but for the hope that his photographs would matter if he did not survive. The impact came like a fist from heaven. Elias tasted blood. Smoke filled the air. The wreckage groaned beneath them like a dying creature. Dale lay slumped against the controls, unconscious but alive. Elias forced himself out of the twisted metal, lungs burning. The airfield stretched before him like a nightmare made real. 40 untouched enemy planes, rows of fuel barrels, abandoned equipment, and somewhere, enemy soldiers. The order rang in his memory. Do not engage. Take photos. Nothing more. But reality felt very different when death stood on all sides. He snapped pictures mechanically, his duty, his training prompting him. But then he heard hurried footsteps, voices, shouts. Enemy soldiers were approaching. Elias dragged Dale behind a fuel cart, breathing hard, heart pounding. He had seconds to decide what kind of man he would be. The airfield was quiet except for the distant shouts of enemy mechanics stumbling toward the crash site. Elias felt something shift inside him. Fear. Yes, but something else too. Responsibility. He stared at the rows of planes, 40 machines capable of leveling American positions, sinking destroyers, tearing through the sky with deadly precision. He could leave them. He could hide. He could wait for rescue. But every second he hesitated felt like a betrayal of every life those planes could one day claim. A single act could change the course of battles. A single moment could dictate the fate of thousands. He whispered to Dale, though the pilot remained unconscious. "I know what they told me to do, but I can't stand here and watch." It was the moment innocence shattered. When a photographer chose action over observation. What Elias lacked in training, he made up for in ingenuity. He noticed fuel barrels left uncapped, ammunition crates stacked carelessly, maintenance trucks with open hoods and exposed wires, planes lined wingtip to wingtip, close enough for fire to leap easily. The enemy had grown complacent. Elias picked up a discarded sidearm. His hands trembled violently. He'd never fired one except in basic training, and even then he'd hated the recoil, but now he needed only accuracy, enough to spark a fire. He positioned the barrels. He lined them with a path of leaking fuel. He glanced toward the Japanese soldiers approaching the wreckage. He had one chance, one spark. He whispered, "Forgive me," though he did not know whether he spoke to the soldiers, the pilots who would never fly, or the part of himself he was about to leave behind. He pulled the trigger. The bullet struck metal. Then, a hiss, a spark, a blinding flash. The explosion ripped through the air like thunder given form. Flames raced across the fuel trail, leaping eagerly toward the nearest zero. The plane erupted, sending pieces of metal spiraling skyward. Then the next plane ignited, and the next, and the next. Each explosion fed the next one, a chain reaction of roaring destruction. The sky filled with black smoke and shrapnel. The earth trembled beneath Elias's knees. Enemy soldiers shouted in confusion, scrambling for cover. The once menacing airfield became a burning graveyard of steel. Elias threw himself over Dale, shielding him with his own body as debris rained down. The heat seared his skin. The smoke choked him. But he did not move. 40 planes, 40 weapons, 40 threats. Destroyed by a man who had been told to take pictures and nothing more. And in that fire, Elias realized something with painful clarity. He had crossed the line between observer and participant, between silence and action, between what he was ordered to be and what he needed to be. The first explosion shook the entire coastline like thunder from the belly of the earth. The barrel Elias shot ignited with a force he had never witnessed. A blinding flash erupted, followed by a rolling wall of heat. The nearest Zero fighter went up instantly, its polished metal warping into molten ribbons as flames devoured it. And then another, and another. The fire spread like a living creature, leaping with violent purpose from wing to wing. Each plane carried its own fuel reserves, turning the entire airstrip into a chain of mini-volcanoes. Elias covered Dale with his body as splinters of shrapnel shot through the air like jagged sparks. He heard the shrill screams of Japanese soldiers scrambling for cover, their frantic footsteps drowned beneath the rising roar of destruction. 40 planes lined that runway, 40 weapons meant to take lives, 40 sparks now erupting into a storm of fire. Elias had seen explosions before through the lens of his camera. But this he felt in his bones. He wasn't a spectator anymore. He was the catalyst. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to hold power. Not the kind that glorifies, but the kind that terrifies. He whispered, shaking, "Dear God, what have I done?" But the fire didn't listen. It only grew. Every act of bravery comes with a bill hidden somewhere in fine print. Elias paid his when a piece of flaming debris, the twisted fragment of a plane's wing, crashed down and clipped his shoulder. Pain erupted through him, hot and sharp, stealing the breath from his lungs. He staggered but didn't fall. He couldn't. Not yet. The inferno behind him painted the sky orange and black, the air filled with the sickening scent of burning oil and metal. The ground trembled as plane after plane detonated, sending shock waves rolling through the soil. Elias pressed his good hand over his wound, feeling warmth, his blood seeping through his fingers. His vision blurred, but he forced himself to stay alert. He turned toward Dale. The boyish pilot, barely 19, was still unconscious. "Not leaving you," Elias murmured, dragging him away from the flames inch by agonizing inch. His legs felt like stone, his lungs burned with every breath. The world buzzed with dizziness. But he kept moving. Just when his strength faltered, a low rumble echoed overhead. Elias looked up. Dark silhouettes moved across the sky, American bombers, B-17s. They were early. They shouldn't have been here yet. Then it hit him. They came because of the reconnaissance photos he'd transmitted before the crash. Even with the chaos, even with the disobedience, he had still done his duty. He laughed weakly, the sound half delirious, half triumphant. "Guess I followed orders after all." The world was a blur for Elias after that. He remembered the roar of bomber engines, the pounding footsteps of boots hitting sand, shouts in English, hands gripping him under the arms. U.S. Marines poured onto the ruined airfield moments after the last explosion faded. They stared wide-eyed at the wreckage, 40 destroyed Japanese Zeros scattered like broken toys across a playground of ash. "Who the hell?" one Marine breathed. Another pointed at Elias, crumpled on the ground but conscious enough to mumble. "He did this," the Marine said incredulously. Elias tried to speak, but his voice cracked. "I only took photos." A medic knelt beside him. "You need help, soldier." He shook his head faintly and pointed to Dale. "Help him first." They did. As they carried Dale and Elias to a field tent, the Marines whispered among themselves. None of them understood how a photographer, a man who wasn't even supposed to fire a weapon, had managed to sabotage an entire airfield alone. Elias drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind replaying the explosions. The fire, the soldiers, the choice he made, the choice he could never undo. Elias woke in a medical tent days later. His shoulder was bandaged tightly, his head throbbed, his throat felt raw. But he was alive. Dale was too, recovering in a bed nearby, his left arm in a sling. When Captain Briggs appeared at the tent's entrance, Elias sat up straighter despite the pain. Briggs' expression was unreadable, jaw tight, eyes sharp. "You disobeyed direct orders," he said. Elias stared at the blanket covering his legs. "I know, sir. You endangered yourself, your pilot, the mission. You acted without authorization." "Yes, sir." Briggs let the silence stretch long and heavy. Then he exhaled, his voice dropping into something softer. "And you destroyed 40 enemy aircraft and prevented a massive counterstrike against our fleet. You saved hundreds, maybe thousands. That's what the upper brass thinks." Elias blinked in surprise. Briggs stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You'll never get a medal for this. Officially, it didn't happen, but—" He paused. "Good work, son." Then he turned and walked away quickly, as if afraid of being seen caring. Elias lay back, overwhelmed. Sometimes the highest praise comes softly. Sometimes the greatest acknowledgement is hidden between words. Weeks passed. Elias regained strength slowly. He returned to his duties, though he carried himself differently now. Quieter, more focused, somehow older. The other soldiers treated him like he was made of legend. "That's the guy," they whispered. "The photographer who blew up the airfield." Elias hated the attention. He hadn't done it for glory. He hadn't even done it for revenge. He'd done it because people would have died if he hadn't. So he went back to doing the one thing he'd always known, taking photos. But something had changed in the way he clicked the shutter. He no longer photographed war. He photographed people in war. Two pilots sharing a cigarette. A chaplain praying with a trembling soldier. A mechanic fixing a plane while humming off-key. His images spread among the units, not officially, but hand to hand. They weren't pictures of conflict. They were pictures of humanity clawing its way through it. And they mattered more than he realized. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the camp gold, Dale limped to Elias's tent. He looked healthier, pale but bright-eyed, a stark contrast to the boy who nearly died in a burning aircraft. He held something in his hand. "You left this behind," Dale said. Elias frowned until he saw it. A cracked, half-melted camera lens, his lens, recovered from the wreckage of their crashed plane. Dale placed it gently in Elias's palm. "You always told me a camera shows the truth," Dale said quietly. "Well, this one shows yours." Elias stared at the warped glass, overwhelmed by the weight of it, not the physical weight, but the symbolic one. "It's ruined," Elias whispered. Dale shook his head. "No, it's a part of what you did, what we survived, a reminder that sometimes the truth gets messy, melted, scarred, but it's still truth." Elias tried to laugh, but it came out as a tremble. His throat tightened. "Thank you," he murmured. From that day on, he kept the lens with him always, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of responsibility. Months later, the war began to tip toward its end. Soldiers felt it in the shift of the air, lighter, hopeful, but still shadowed by fear. On a humid afternoon near a small captured village, Elias wandered with his camera slung over his shoulder. He'd been assigned to document the area for intelligence, but his instincts led him elsewhere. He saw a commotion in a narrow dirt path. a wounded American soldier leaning against a tree, and beside him, a young Japanese boy, maybe 10 years old, holding a small bamboo cup filled with water. The boy's hands shook as he raised the cup to the soldier's lips. The soldier hesitated, then accepted. And in that fragile exchange, something cracked open inside Elias. He lifted his camera. Click. It was the softest photo he ever took. The most important one, too. Two enemies, children of different flags, meeting not with bullets but compassion. That single image eventually circulated through diplomatic channels and was later displayed during early discussions of post-war reconciliation. Elias would always say, "War divides armies, kindness unites people." Despite the rumors, Elias never told anyone the full story of the airfield, not the Marines, not the Air Force, not even his closest friends. If asked, he'd shrug it off. "I was just lucky. The fuel barrels did most of the work. I don't remember much." He didn't hide the truth out of shame. He hid it because he didn't want the story to be about destruction. He wanted the world to focus on what came after, the rebuilding, the healing, the human connections he captured through his camera lens. At night, he sometimes pulled out the melted lens Dale had given him. He'd run his thumb over its warped edges and think, if anyone ever learns the truth, let it be for the right reasons. But he kept the story locked away. Some truths are too heavy to carry publicly. Some acts are meant to stay quiet. When the war finally ended, Elias returned home. He stepped off the ship with a limp in his step and a camera bag over his shoulder. People praised soldiers in the streets, embraced them, showered them with gratitude. Elias smiled politely, but inside he only felt relief. He married a gentle schoolteacher named Rose who loved his quiet nature and the way he saw beauty in ordinary things. Together, they opened a small photography studio downtown. Elias became known for taking portraits that felt alive, images where people looked like they were about to speak, laugh, or breathe. Clients often asked, "How do you make us look so real?" Elias would simply say, "I listen before I look." His war photos were never sold, never framed. He kept them in a box in his attic, wrapped in old cloths like fragile memories. He focused on life now, newborns, newlyweds, families. But he never stopped carrying the melted lens in his pocket. It reminded him that destruction wasn't his legacy. Humanity was. Decades later, when Elias passed peacefully in his sleep at 78, his family gathered to sort through his belongings. They found boxes of photos, weddings, sunsets, children laughing. Beautiful memories captured by a man who understood how precious life was. Then his grandson discovered a small wooden box hidden beneath rolls of negatives. A note was taped to the lid, "For whoever needs to know the truth." Inside lay his cracked military camera, Dale's melted lens, a faded map of the Japanese airfield, and a letter written in Elias's looping script. His grandson read aloud, "I was told to take photos, but sometimes life asks more of us than the rules allow. If you read this, know that courage isn't loud. It's quiet, it's painful, and it always costs something. I don't want to be remembered for what I destroyed, but for the lives I hope to save." Tears filled the boy's eyes. Rose, frail but smiling softly, placed a hand on his shoulder. "He never bragged," she whispered. "He never wanted recognition." "Then, why did he write this?" the grandson asked. Rose looked toward the window where sunlight streamed onto the floor. "Because some stories," she said, "aren't meant to make a man famous. They're meant to guide the people who come after." And so, long after the war forgot his name, the world learned the truth. Not of a soldier, not of a hero, but of a photographer who chose humanity over orders. A man who was told only to take photos, but saved lives instead.